with nothing but a cracked leather handbag, a single rolling suitcase, and 10 loose dollars folded in her coat pocket. 80-year-old Agnes Caldwell stood on the frost-covered sidewalk of Millhaven, North Carolina, watching the front door of the only home she had known for 43 years pull shut behind her, locked by the two children she had spent her entire life raising. What Lawrence and Diana never counted on, what nobody in that quiet mountain town could have predicted, was that the crumbling stone chapel Agnes would buy 3 days later for $10 at a county auction held something sealed inside its walls for over a century. A discovery so significant it would force historians across the state to reconsider a forgotten chapter of American history that most people assumed was gone for good. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. October 9th, 2021. Agnes Caldwell had lived on Ember Lane for 43 years. She and her husband George had bought the white clapboard house when Lawrence was still a baby, before Diana was born, before the garden out back had ever seen a tomato plant. Over the years, the house absorbed the full weight of a life. Children's laughter, holiday meals, arguments that resolved by morning, and eventually, the slower rhythms of two people growing old together in a place they had chosen and kept choosing. George died in 2018. A stroke, sudden and complete. Agnes stayed in the house because it was paid off and it was hers, and it held everything she had left of him, including the raised garden beds he had built the summer before his diagnosis, insisting he would get another season out of them. At 80, Agnes moved slower than she once had. Her knees complained on the stairs. She wore a medical alert bracelet her daughter had mailed her 2 Christmases ago, still in its packaging until Agnes finally put it on just to stop the follow-up calls. But she was clear-headed and capable, managing her household on $1,340 a month from Social Security, keeping the yard tidy, cooking her own meals, driving herself to the grocery store on Tuesday mornings when the parking lot was quiet. She had never once asked her children for anything beyond a visit. 6 months before that October morning, Lawrence had come for Sunday lunch. He was 52, worked in finance down in Charlotte, always arrived with a firm handshake and something new in the driveway. Over coffee, he placed a folder on the kitchen table and described its contents as routine estate planning. No probate complications. A clean arrangement that would protect her and simplify things for everyone when the time came. It just puts all 3 of our names on the deed together, he said. You keep full rights to the house. We're just making it official. Agnes read through the documents. She asked a few questions. Lawrence answered them patiently. She signed where he indicated. She did not call a lawyer first. She should have. What Lawrence had presented as a formality was, in practice, a transfer of shared legal control. Joint ownership with right of survivorship meant her children held as much authority over the property as she did. She wouldn't understand what that actually meant until the Thursday evening they drove up together and sat her down in her own living room. Diana arrived 20 minutes after Lawrence. Agnes had made coffee. We've been thinking about your situation, Diana said, hands wrapped around a mug she wouldn't finish. About what makes sense going forward. What made sense, Lawrence explained, was a senior living facility outside Asheville. Private room, 3 meals a day, medical staff on site. The monthly cost was $2,900. Agnes did the math immediately. That's more than double my income. The house would cover it, Lawrence said. We spoke with an agent last week. You're looking at around $310,000 in this market. That gives you years of security. You spoke with an agent. We wanted real numbers before we came to you. Agnes set her cup down. She looked at her son, then her daughter, then back at her son. She asked them what they thought George would have said about this conversation. Neither one answered. Diana's voice softened in the way that made things worse, not better. Mom, you're 80. You're alone out here. The stairs are a risk. The furnace is original to the house. What happens if something goes wrong and there's no one around? I manage fine. You're becoming a burden on yourself, Lawrence said. The words sat in the room. Agnes didn't respond to it directly. She had heard it, though, and she would keep hearing it long after they left. They had already listed the house. She had until the end of the month to take what she could carry. The facility required a deposit she couldn't cover on her own, and when she said so, Lawrence told her they'd pull it from the sale proceeds once things closed. "Everything's already arranged," Agnes said. "We're trying to help you," Diana told her. Agnes looked at them both, two people she had fed and taught and worried over for decades, sitting across from her in her own living room, explaining how they were helping her out of it. "You've already decided," she said. "That's not the same as helping." They left that night without finishing their coffee. Agnes sat alone in the silence they left behind, her hand resting on the arm of the chair she had owned since 1987, and she let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. Then she went upstairs and started to pack. Agnes packed for 3 days, not because she had that much to take. After 43 years in the same house, the accumulation was staggering: shelves of books, a cedar chest full of quilts, George's tools still hanging in the garage exactly as he'd left them. But because every drawer she opened, every cabinet she cleared, was a small goodbye. She couldn't take most of it. She had no car big enough, no storage unit she could afford, and no clear destination once she stepped out the door. She kept what mattered most: clothes for a week, her mother's silver hairbrush, a photograph of her and George taken at Chimney Rock the summer Lawrence started high school, both of them laughing at something the camera didn't catch, a small Bible with her name stamped on the cover in faded gold letters, George's pocket watch, which hadn't run in years but still felt warm when she held it. Everything else would go with the house: the furniture, the hand-sewn quilts she had made over 3 decades, the kitchen table where her grandchildren had colored and spilled and slowly grown too old to sit at. She made herself stop thinking about each thing before the thought could finish forming. If she let any of it land fully, she wouldn't get through the packing. On the morning of October 31st, a moving crew arrived right on schedule. Not to help Agnes, to empty the house for the new buyer. Lawrence and Diana weren't there. They had sent instructions ahead. One of the movers, a young man with a clipboard, told her politely that she'd need her things out front before they started on the main rooms. That was when she noticed the newspaper. Someone had left a copy of the Millhaven Courier on top of a recycling bin 2 houses down, folded open to the classifieds. Agnes walked over and picked it up. She wasn't sure what drew her to it. She hadn't read a print paper in years, but she looked anyway. Near the bottom of the second column, a small notice: Caldwell County to auction condemned and tax-delinquent properties. Minimum opening bid, $1. Auction to be held Monday, November 1st, 10 a.m., County Administration Building, Room 4. She read it twice. She looked at her suitcase. She looked at the house on Ember Lane being emptied in real time. She thought about the $47.60 in her wallet and the deposit that hadn't cleared and the sister she hadn't called in 2 years. Then she folded the newspaper, tucked it into her handbag, and started walking toward town. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The County Administration Building was a flat-roofed concrete structure that had not been updated since roughly 1974. Agnes arrived at 9:40 the following morning, suitcase in tow. She had spent the night at a church shelter 3 blocks from the bus depot, the first time in her life she had ever needed to. She had not slept much. Room 4 was a low-ceilinged space with folding chairs arranged in loose rows and a podium at the front. About 25 people were already seated when Agnes arrived, mostly men in their 40s and 50s, some in work jackets, others in the kind of business casual that said real estate investor without a business card. They talked loudly, comparing notes on which properties had potential and which were money pits. Agnes found a chair near the back and sat quietly. A few people glanced at her, an elderly woman with a rolling suitcase, clearly out of place. The glances didn't linger. She wasn't competition. The auctioneer was a heavy-set man named Harold Sims, mid-60s, with a brisk efficiency of someone who had been moving distressed properties for 2 decades and stopped being surprised years ago. "Let's get moving," he said, right at 10 a.m., 19 properties today. All sold as is, no warranties, no guarantees, no exceptions. Minimum opening bid is $1. Cash, money order, or cashier's check, Paid immediately upon sale. We clear. The room murmured agreement. The first several properties moved fast. A commercial lot near the highway sold for $28,000. A house with severe water damage went for $19,500. A parcel of raw land sparked a brief back and forth between two men in the front row and closed at $11,000. Agnes watched it all carefully, learning the rhythm, noting how Harold Sims paced the room, how the investors signaled interest, how quickly things moved once bidding opened. After 90 minutes, they had cleared 17 of the 19 listings. Agnes's hands were cold inside her coat pockets. Second to last, Sims said, shuffling his papers. This one's special. His tone made clear he was being sarcastic. Property number 18. Old Trace Road, approximately 9 miles outside Millhaven. Structure is a single-room stone chapel, roughly 800 square feet, built around 1869. Abandoned for at least 20 years. No electricity, no running water, no functioning septic system. The roof has partially collapsed on the eastern side. Foundation is cracked in several locations. County inspector declared it structurally unsafe and flagged it for demolition. A few people in the room chuckled. Someone near the middle said something quiet that got a bigger laugh. Sims kept reading from his sheet. Property sits on 1.8 acres of overgrown land. Access is via an unpaved forestry road that may be impassable in wet weather. There is documented evidence of animal habitation inside, and apparently, locals have been calling it the Ghost Chapel for as long as anyone can remember. The room laughed outright at that. Who wants to open at $1? Sims said, with the half-smile of a man who already knew the answer. Silence. $1. Somebody give me $1 for a genuine piece of Western North Carolina history. Nothing. A man near the front shook his head. Sims reached for the next sheet of paper. All right, moving on. $10, Agnes said from the back of the room. Every head turned. Sims squinted toward her. I'm sorry. Agnes stood so he could see her clearly. Her voice didn't shake. $10. That is my bid. The room went quiet for about 2 seconds. Then the laughter started. One man in the middle row turned fully around in his chair to get a better look at her. Another leaned toward the person beside him and said something that produced a snort. Someone near the front muttered, Ghost Chapel's got to take her, and the row behind him thought that was worth repeating. Harold Sims raised a hand for quiet. Ma'am, I want to make sure you understand what you're bidding on. The structure has been condemned. The roof is a collapse risk. No electricity, no water, no road you want to drive in wet weather. Are you certain you want to proceed? $10 is my bid, Agnes said. Sims looked around the room. Anyone want to come in at 11? Save the lady some trouble. More laughter. No bids. Going once at $10, he said. Going twice. He paused. Nobody moved. Sold. Property number 18 to the lady in the back. Scattered applause, the kind given at a punchline. Agnes walked to the front of the room, counted 10 $1 bills onto the table, and signed the transfer documents where Sims indicated. He slid a manila envelope across. Deed, survey map, a photocopied page with typed directions to the property. Congratulations, Mrs. Caldwell, he said, without quite meaning it. Old Trace Road, 9 miles out. Good luck to you. As she turned to go, a man in a canvas jacket touched her elbow. He wasn't being cruel, more careful, like someone delivering information they felt obligated to pass along. He told her he'd actually visited the property 2 years earlier, thought about buying it, walked away fast. The east wall was bowing outward. Whatever roof remained wouldn't survive another hard winter. Do you have somewhere else to go? He asked. While you figure things out. I'll be fine, Agnes said. He nodded once and stepped back. She picked up her suitcase and walked out of room 4 while 25 real estate investors watched her go. The deed in that envelope had her name on it. Agnes Caldwell, owner. Nobody could take it from her. Getting to Old Trace Road proved harder than finding the auction. She couldn't afford a cab for a 9-mile trip on back roads, and no bus line ran out that far. She walked the first 2 miles to the edge of town and stopped at a small hardware store to ask directions. The man behind the counter was Ray Buckley, tall, late 60s, gray beard, the unhurried manner of someone who had never lived anywhere but this county. He knew Old Trace Road. He'd been past the chapel plenty of times. "You bought it," he said. "This morning." He studied her for a moment, then reached for his jacket on the hook behind him. "I close up at 4. I'll drive you out. I can't pay you for that." "Didn't ask," he said. They drove mostly in silence. Paved road gave way to gravel after the 3rd mile. The gravel thinned to 2 dirt tracks with tall grass between them, branches scraping the truck's mirrors. Ray didn't mention it. The trees opened into a small clearing just as the sun dropped behind the ridge. And there it was. Agnes had expected bad. The inspector's report, the auctioneer's tone, the laughter in that basement room. All of it had prepared her for something rough. What she hadn't anticipated was the feeling of standing in front of it. The chapel was built entirely from stacked fieldstone, gray-brown mountain rock that looked grown from the ground rather than placed there. 3 walls stood fully upright. The 4th, the eastern one, leaned outward at an angle that made Ray exhale slowly through his nose when he saw it. The roof had collapsed inward on the east side, leaving a hole roughly 8 feet wide and open to the sky. The west side still held its bare rafters, letting the last of the daylight filter through in pale strips. Every window opening was empty, just dark rectangles framing the darkening tree line. The front door hung from its lower hinge only. The upper one had pulled clean from the stone. Vines blanketed most of the southern wall. A young oak had taken root directly against the foundation and was pressing steadily into the base stones. Ray found a section of floor near the western wall that was relatively clear. Agnes pulled a pine branch from the tree line, and they swept the worst of it out. Before he left, he gave her the lantern, a wool blanket from behind the truck seat, and his number written on the back of his store receipt. "I pass Old Trace twice a week," he said. "I'll look in on you." "You don't have to." "I know," he said. He drove away. Agnes stood in the clearing and listened to the engine fade through the trees. Wind moved through the chapel's empty windows with a low, even sound. Something skittered in the rubble near the far corner. She clicked on the lantern and went inside. She spread the blanket on the cleared section of floor, set George's pocket watch on a flat stone where she could see it, and sat down with her back against the cold fieldstone wall. She ate the last granola bar she had from the shelter the night before and drank from a water bottle she'd filled at the administration building before the auction. Then she pulled the blanket around her shoulders and looked at the stone altar at the far end of the room, pale in the lantern's light. She was 80 years old. She had $37 left. She was alone in a condemned building 9 miles from town with no plan beyond surviving until morning. But the deed in her handbag said this was hers. She stayed awake most of that first night. By the time gray light showed through the broken roof, she had made her decision. She was going to fix this building, stone by stone, board by board, however long it took and however hard it got. She folded the blanket, stood slowly, and walked outside into the pale morning. 2 crows sat on the ridge of the western wall, watching her. She looked back at them. Then she walked the full perimeter of the chapel, hands trailing along the cold stone, already sorting the problems by what needed fixing first. The first day had begun. Agnes's first full day at the chapel started at dawn and ended when she could no longer see her hands in front of her face. She had no tools, no bucket, no broom, no gloves. What she had was a pine branch she'd already been using to sweep, a pocket knife, the wool blanket Ray had left, and the kind of determination that doesn't come from optimism. It comes from having nothing left to lose. She started with the floor. The centuries-old leaves, the animal droppings, the flat gray remains of rotted pew wood. She swept it all toward the open doorway using the pine branch in long, slow arcs. When the branch wore down to a stub, she cut another. Her shoulders ached by mid-morning. She kept going. By early afternoon, she had cleared the western 2/3 of the floor, exposing packed earth that was solid underfoot and dry enough near the walls to be usable. The east end was still open to the sky through the collapsed section of roof. Rain would find that corner every time, so Agnes wrote it off for now and focused her attention on what was salvageable. Water was the first real problem. She had 1 bottle, and it was empty before noon. She spent an hour walking the perimeter of the clearing and found what she needed: a narrow creek running along the base of the slope below the chapel, fast and cold, fed by the higher ridges. She had no container larger than her water bottle, so she made the trip 4 times that afternoon. The slope back up was steep. Her knees registered every step. She found a rusted tin pail buried under collapsed debris near what had once been a side entrance, just a gap in the south wall, now sealed with a growth of vines so thick they functioned like a door. The pail had a hole near the base, but held water long enough to be useful for cleaning. She used it to rinse sections of wall and scrub the stone altar at the far end of the room with a rag torn from her spare shirt. By late afternoon, the chapel looked less like something condemned and more like something interrupted. It had good bones. The stone walls that still stood were solid. She pressed her palms flat against them and felt no give, no flex. Whoever had built this place in 1869 had known exactly what they were doing. The mortar between the stones was lime-based, much of it still intact after 150 years. The weak points were the east wall, the missing roof section, and the windows. Everything else was structure she could work with. That evening, Ray Buckley's truck came down Old Trace Road as promised. He didn't say much when he stepped inside. Looked at the cleared floor, the scrubbed altar, the wall sections Agnes had brushed clean. He walked the length of the chapel slowly, knocked on the good walls with his knuckles, looked up at the remaining rafters. "You did all this today," he said. "Most of it." He had brought a paper bag with him, 2 sandwiches, an apple, a container of coffee, still warm from a thermos. He sat on the altar like it was a counter and told her it wasn't charity, it was a neighbor bringing food, which was different. Agnes didn't argue. She was hungry enough that argument would have been dishonest. While she ate, Ray told her about a woman named June Harmon who ran a small diner on the main road through Millhaven. The Harmon table, open from 5 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. June had been looking for early kitchen help for weeks and hadn't found anyone reliable. "She's up at 4 every morning anyway," Ray said. "Wouldn't hurt to walk in and ask." Agnes asked how far the walk was. "For miles, maybe a little more." She nodded. She would go in the morning. Ray left her with his second blanket, a small camping stove, and 2 cans of beans from his truck bed. He said he'd been meaning to clear out the camping gear anyway. Agnes accepted without protest. That night she cooked one of the cans on the camping stove and ate sitting cross-legged on the cleared floor, her back against the western wall. The chapel was cold in the way that stone buildings always are, a deep, settled cold that had nothing to do with drafts or wind and everything to do with mass. She wore her coat and both blankets and was still aware of it. But the lantern threw a warm circle across the pale granite altar and the rough stone walls, and in that light the chapel looked less like a ruin. It looked like a room. Agnes sat with that thought for a while. Then she lay down, closed her eyes, and slept straight through until 4. The walk to Millhaven in the dark took her just under an hour. Ray had drawn her a rough map on the back of a receipt. She followed it with the lantern held low, the road empty in both directions, frost on the grass at the verge. The Harmon table was lit from the inside when she arrived, a warm yellow rectangle in the dark of the main road. Through the window, Agnes could see a woman moving efficiently behind the counter, pulling things from shelves, getting ahead of the morning. Agnes pushed open the door. June Harmon was 58, short, with cropped gray hair and the alert, no-nonsense manner of someone who had been running her own business long enough to assess people quickly. She looked at Agnes once, taking in the coat, the lantern still in hand, the dirt at the hem of her slacks. "You're up early," June said. "I heard you need kitchen help." June poured 2 cups of coffee without being asked and set one on the counter in front of Agnes. "Where are you coming from at this hour?" "Old Trace Road." June paused. "You're the woman who bought the chapel." Word had already moved through town. Agnes wasn't surprised. "I am," she said. June studied her for a moment. Then she said, "Can you be here by 5 every morning?" "I was here before 5 this morning." June almost smiled. 3 days a week. For hours a shift. I pay $14 an hour cash. You'll be prepping, washing, whatever needs doing." Agnes calculated quickly. 3 days, for hours, $14. That was $168 a week. Nearly $700 a month. Combined with her Social Security, once she could get the forwarding address sorted, it would be enough to buy materials. Not quickly, but steadily. "I'll start tomorrow," Agnes said. "You already started," June replied, and handed her an apron. The routine settled into shape within the first 2 weeks, and it was brutal in the way that only sustainable things can be. Agnes rose at 4 every morning. She cooked whatever she had on the camping stove. Rice, canned beans, occasionally an egg if Ray had left some in the bag he dropped twice a week. She ate in the dark, washed her face with creek water she'd carried up the slope the evening before, and walked the 4 miles to Millhaven in time to hang her coat and tie her apron before June unlocked the Harmon table's front door. For hours in the kitchen, washing, chopping, scrubbing, stocking, then the 4-mile walk back. By the time she reached the clearing, the morning was half gone. She had the remaining daylight for the chapel. On the 4 days, she didn't work at the diner. She was at the building from first light until she lost visibility. The windows came first. 6 of them, narrow stone-framed openings, each roughly 2 feet wide and 4 feet tall. Nothing left in them but cold air and the occasional startled bird. Agnes couldn't afford glass. What she could do was make them tight enough to hold heat. She gathered straight branches from the tree line, stripped the bark, and wove them into firm panels using strips of green vine as binding. She mixed a mortar from creek clay, ash from the fire she'd been building in the hearth, and water, packing it into the woven frames until each panel was dense and solid. She sealed every opening with 3 applications, letting each coat dry fully before adding the next. It took 3 weeks to do all 6. The clay cracked in places as it dried, and she filled the cracks and did it again. Her hands blistered, calloused over, then blistered again. By the 5th week, they stopped blistering entirely. The east wall was the next problem. The outward lean Ray had noticed on that first evening was worsening with the wet weather. Agnes couldn't fix the structural cause, but she could slow the failure. Below the creek, she found a stand of young tulip poplars, straight-grained and stiff. She cut 6 of them with the handsaw Ray had left her and notched their tops to fit against the upper course of the east wall, then drove the butts into the ground at an angle from the outside, bracing it the way old cathedral photographs showed arched stone supports holding up walls from the outside. The work was rough. It held. The roof she broke into smaller problems so it didn't swallow her. The collapsed eastern section she left alone for now. That would need lumber and someone who understood load-bearing angles better than she did. What she could address was the surviving western half, which still had its original rafters, but had shed most of its slate tiles over the years. Slate wasn't an option at no cost. Instead, she cut pine boughs by the armload and layered them across the rafters from eave to ridge, each row overlapping the one below like a bird's feathers. Pine pitch ran naturally between layers when the afternoon sun warmed them, acting as a seal. When rain came the 3rd week of November, she stood inside and watched the western ceiling carefully. For drip points, she marked each one with chalk and patched them the following morning. The cold took longest to solve. Stone holds heat well in summer and holds cold just as faithfully in winter. The chapel's north wall had a wide hearth built into it, low and broad, which Agnes hadn't noticed at first because it was packed solid with bird nests, chunks of broken slate, and old collapsed debris. She spent a full day clearing it. Ray climbed onto the roof and confirmed the flue was open. The first fire she built in the hearth smoked badly enough to drive her outside for 10 minutes with her eyes streaming. She found the damper, a flat iron plate seized with rust, and worked it free with patience and a flat stone, rocking it back and forth until it moved. The second fire burned clean and hot. A heated stone room holds warmth for hours after the fire dies. She started sleeping through the night. Ray came twice a week without announcing himself. He would simply appear at the end of Old Trace Road with something in the truck. A roll of wire, a bag of quicklime, a better saw, once a pair of thick leatherwork gloves that Agnes put on without a word and wore until they shaped themselves to her hands. He would look at whatever she'd finished since his last visit, say very little about it, and help with the current problem until the light changed. June fed her. At the end of Agnes's 2nd week in the kitchen, June added a 5th morning shift and began sending her home with whatever hadn't moved. Bread from the breakfast service, soup from lunch, the occasional slice of pie wrapped in wax paper and set on top of Agnes's coat on the peg by the door. June called it waste reduction. Agnes let her call it that. By early December, word had settled firmly through Millhaven. The woman who bought the ghost chapel for $10. People had opinions, most of them doubtful. A handful stopped Ray at his store to ask how she was managing. The general read around town was that Agnes Caldwell was either remarkably tough or dangerously hard-headed, and nobody had landed firmly on which. Agnes didn't spend time on the question. She had a roof to finish. Agnes found it on a Tuesday in mid-December, which was otherwise an unremarkable day. She had been working on the altar, the solid granite slab at the far end of the chapel that had stood untouched since her first night. She had cleaned it weeks earlier, scrubbing away the moss and water staining, and had left it alone since. It wasn't a structural problem. It wasn't leaking. She had other things to fix first. But on that Tuesday, she noticed something she had missed in the lantern light of those early weeks. The altar wasn't one piece of stone. It was two. The main slab on top was granite, heavy and continuous. Below it sat a second section, slightly darker in color, forming the front face of the altar base, and running along its left edge was a seam that didn't match the surrounding stonework. A straight seam, deliberate clean, not a crack. She pressed her fingers into it. A gap perhaps an eighth of an inch wide, running floor to top in a perfect vertical line. She got the flat pry bar Ray had left her and worked the tip into the gap. She didn't force it. She applied slow, even pressure, rocking gently, the way she had learned to work rusted metal. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then something gave, a soft grinding of stone on stone, and the panel swung inward on a pivot point at its center, rotating to reveal a space behind it roughly 2 feet wide and 3 feet deep. Agnes held the lantern close. Inside was a wooden chest, low and flat, wrapped in oilcloth that had dried and cracked at the folds but was otherwise intact. She lifted it carefully. It was lighter than she expected. She sat on the chapel floor and opened it. Inside, wrapped in layers of cotton muslin yellowed but holding, were documents. A stack of handwritten pages bound with linen cord. A folded map on heavy paper, drawn in ink faded to pale brown. Several letters, folded and sealed with wax that had gone brittle. And at the very bottom, a small leather-bound ledger, its cover stamped with a simple cross and the words, "In service of the Lord and of those he sends to us." E.J. Connor, 1863. Agnes sat down on the cold floor and opened the ledger. The handwriting was small and careful, each entry dated. Names, first names only, sometimes with a brief descriptor alongside. Samuel, tall, scar on left hand, speaks some French. Moved north, October 4th. God keep him. And below that, a week later, Miriam, traveling with 2 children, boy and infant girl. Rested 3 days. Moved north, October 9th. Page after page. Names and dates running from 1863 all the way to 1871. Agnes read slowly, turning each page with the care she had once reserved for her mother's Bible. She understood what she was holding before she had finished the first dozen entries. This chapel, her chapel, the ghost chapel on Old Trace Road, had been a station, a stop on a network that moved people north through the mountain corridors of western North Carolina. First before the war's end, then after it, when danger didn't stop simply because the law had changed. Elias J. Connor, whoever he had been, had recorded every person who passed through this building. Every name he knew, every date, every notation about where they had come from and which direction they went when they left. The folded map showed a web of routes, ridge paths, creek crossings, farmsteads marked with small crosses, running north and west through the mountains. Several of the cross-marked locations Agnes didn't recognize. Others she did. One was a property not 4 miles from where she was sitting. She stayed on that floor for a long time. Ray came 2 days later. Agnes didn't wait for him to finish looking around the chapel before she brought him to the altar and showed him the compartment, the chest, the ledger. She watched his face as he read the first page, then the second. He looked up without speaking for a moment. "Agnes," he said, "do you understand what this is?" "I think so, but I want someone who actually knows to tell me." Ray set the ledger down carefully. He had been a high school history teacher for 28 years before he opened the hardware store. She had learned that early in their acquaintance, mentioned once and not again. He knew people at Western Carolina University. A historian there, Dr. Victor Nance, had spent his career studying Reconstruction-era Appalachia. He had published 2 books on the subject. The second focused entirely on documented and undocumented freedom networks operating through the mountain counties before and after the war. If what's in that chest is authentic, Ray said, Victor will know within 10 minutes of looking at it. Agnes thought about that. She looked at the chest sitting on the floor of the chapel she had spent 2 months patching and bracing and slowly pulling back from the edge of collapse. He comes here, she said. I'm not moving any of it. Understood, Ray said. I'll call him tonight. Agnes nodded once. Then she picked up her pry bar and went back to work on the eastern wall. The chest could wait 2 more days. The wall could not. Dr. Victor Nance arrived on a Friday morning, 2 weeks after Ray's call. He was younger than Agnes had pictured, early 50s, compact and precise in his movements, wearing a field jacket with too many pockets. He drove a university truck with Western Carolina stenciled on the door and brought a photographer, a digital recorder, and a flat case of archival equipment Agnes didn't recognize. Ray introduced them in the clearing. Nance shook Agnes's hand and looked at the chapel for a long moment before he said anything. I've driven past Old Trace Road a dozen times, he said. Never knew there was anything back here. Most people didn't, Agnes said. Come in. She had kept the chest exactly where she found it, back inside the compartment behind the altar face, the oilcloth rewrapped, the panel closed. She wanted him to see it the way she had found it. She opened the compartment herself, lifted the chest out, and set on the floor. Nance crouched and opened it. He was quiet for a long time. The photographer documented everything, the chest, the wrapping, the ledger still in place, the folded map. Nance lifted the ledger with gloved hands and turned to the first page. He read in silence. His expression didn't change dramatically, but something shifted behind his eyes. He went through 6 pages before he looked up. Where did you find the compartment? He asked. Agnes showed him the seam, the pivot mechanism, the way the panel swung inward on its center point. Nance examined the hinge carefully, then stood and walked the full length of the chapel with his hands in his pockets, looking at the walls, the floor, the hearth. There may be more, he said. These spaces were often built in multiples. One obvious enough to satisfy a casual search, others less so. Agnes hadn't considered that. Nance spent the next 4 hours examining every surface. He found nothing else that day, but he told Agnes that ground-penetrating equipment could map the full floor plan and flag any anomalies beneath the surface. He wanted to bring a team back. Before he left, he told her what she already suspected, stated plainly and without ceremony. The ledger was consistent with documented Reconstruction-era record-keeping. The handwriting matched mid-19th century North Carolina convention. The names and dates cross-referenced against census records and existing historical accounts of freedom movement activity in the mountain counties aligned precisely. The map corresponded to at least 3 routes already partially documented in state archives and filled gaps that historians had been trying to connect for decades. The Connor Ledger, as he was already calling it, was the most complete primary record of a mountain freedom corridor ever found in the state of North Carolina. The chapel itself, Nance said, pausing at the doorway to look back at it, is the site. This is where those people rested. This is where Elias Connor wrote those names down. That matters as much as the document. Agnes walked him to his truck. He asked what her plans were for the property. I live here, she said. He nodded. There are preservation grants for sites like this. State Historical Commission, private foundations. If you're willing to allow academic access, I can start that process. You'd stay as the site's custodian. Agnes thought about the word custodian. It felt right. Start the process, she said. The formal historical designation came in March, 4 months after Nance's first visit. The period in between was busy in ways Agnes hadn't anticipated. Nance returned twice with a small team. Ground-penetrating radar mapped the chapel floor and found 2 areas of interest beneath the earth near the north wall, cavities consistent with concealed storage. Careful excavation revealed a second compartment, smaller than the first, containing 3 more folded documents and a crude wooden carving of a bird Agnes couldn't identify. A fourth-year archaeology student who had come along sat quietly with the carving for a long moment before saying it was a martin, a purple martin, historically associated with freedom in African-American folk tradition. That evening, Agnes sat with the carving on the cleared floor and felt the full weight of what this building had been, what it had held, what it had protected. The State Historical Commission's designation came with a letter, a small bronze marker for the exterior wall, and a grant. $47,000 in its first disbursement. A structural engineer stabilized the east wall properly. A roofer who specialized in historical buildings replaced the collapsed eastern section with period-consistent materials. The windows got glass. The hearth got a proper damper and a clean flue. The Connor Ledger went to Western Carolina University for archiving and digitization. Under an agreement Agnes had Ray's lawyer friend review twice before she signed. The original documents would return to the chapel upon completion of a proper archival case, which the university would fund and install. She retained ownership of everything found on her property. Academic access required her written permission each time. Nance arranged a stipend from the university's historical research budget, $400 a month in exchange for Agnes serving as the site's official caretaker. Combined with her Social Security, now forwarded to Old Trace Road, and her mornings at June's Diner, she was earning more than she had since George was alive. By late spring, the chapel was unrecognizable from the ruin she had walked into on that first November night. The 3 standing walls gleamed, pointed and sealed. The roof held through 2 hard rains without a single drip. The windows caught the morning sun and threw clean light across the floor, swept bare and even. The altar stood at the far end exactly as Elias Connor had left it. Outside, a gravel path ran from Old Trace Road to the chapel door. A bronze marker sat beside the entrance. Connor Chapel, established 1863. Designated North Carolina Historical Site, 2022. Agnes had planted a kitchen garden along the south wall, where the afternoon light was best. Tomatoes, beans, herbs. On the morning the garden put out its first ripe tomato, she sat on the stone step and ate it straight off the vine, still warm from the sun. She thought about George and his raised beds. She was 81 years old. She owned a historical site. She had a purpose that hadn't existed a year ago. Lawrence and Diana came on a Saturday in late June. Agnes was in the garden when she heard the car. She recognized the sound of Lawrence's engine before she saw the vehicle. Same model he'd had for 3 years. Same way it idled high before he cut it. She stayed where she was, kneeling between the tomato plants, and waited. They came around the side of the chapel together. Both dressed for a weekend outing rather than anything particular. Casual, careful, the way people dress when they want to appear relaxed but have rehearsed what they're going to say. Lawrence had put on weight since October. Diana looked tired around the eyes. Agnes stood slowly and brushed the soil from her knees. "Mom," Lawrence said. She waited. "We heard about the chapel," Diana said. "About the discovery. It's been in the news." She paused. "We've been trying to find you for months." "You knew the county I lived in," Agnes said. "You knew Ray Buckley's hardware store was the only one for 12 miles. Finding me wasn't the hard part." Neither of them answered that directly. Lawrence looked at the chapel, the pointed stone walls, the new roof, the bronze marker by the door, the garden along the south side. His expression moved through several things before settling into something Agnes recognized from when he was a boy, caught between wanting something and knowing he didn't deserve it. "This is something," he said. "What you've done here." "Yes," Agnes agreed. "We wanted to see you. Make sure you were all right. You can see that I am." Diana stepped forward slightly. "Mom, we know how things ended. We handled it badly. We were thinking about the practical side of everything, and we didn't think enough about how it felt for you." She stopped. "We're sorry." Agnes looked at her daughter for a long moment. Diana had her father's eyes. She had always had her father's eyes, and Agnes had always been unable to look at them without feeling something. "I believe you mean that," Agnes said. "But I want to tell you what happened after you left me on that sidewalk because I don't think you've fully considered it." She told him. She didn't raise her voice or soften the facts. She told them about the shelter, the auction room, and the laughter. The first night on the chapel floor with a wool blanket and a lantern. The 4-mile walks to June's diner in the dark, through November and December and January. The clay she mixed with her bare hands to seal the windows. The east wall she braced with tulip poplars. The chest behind the altar and the names in the ledger. All those names written down by a man who understood what it meant to give people a safe place when the world outside had decided they didn't deserve one. She held up her hands. The work was still written into them. Faint scars, permanent calluses along each palm. I did all of that without help from family, she said. I had Ray Buckley, who was a stranger. I had June Harmon, who gave me work when I needed it most. I had Dr. Nance, who took what I found seriously and treated me like someone worth listening to. She lowered her hands. Not once did either of you call. Lawrence's jaw tightened. We didn't know where you were. You didn't look. The silence that followed was long enough to become uncomfortable and then move past that into something more honest. Diana spoke first. Is there anything we can do? Going forward, Agnes thought about it genuinely, which was more than they perhaps expected. If you want to rebuild something, she said, then come back without an agenda. Come because you want to know who I am now, not because you want something for what I've built. I'm not interested in transactions. I had enough of those last October. She looked at them both. That's the only door that's open. Lawrence nodded once. Diana looked at the garden. Neither of them pushed further. They stayed for 20 minutes. Agnes showed them the chapel's interior, the altar, the compartment behind it, the archival case where the Connor ledger now rested in climate control preservation. They were quiet inside, the way most people go quiet in that room when they understand what it was. Before they left, Lawrence stopped at the door and turned back. He started to say something, stopped, then said, Dad would have loved this. Agnes looked at him. Yes, she said. He would have. They drove away down Old Trace Road. Agnes stood in the clearing and watched the dust settle after the car was gone. She felt no particular satisfaction, no unfinished anger. Mostly she felt the day around her, the heat of the late June sun on the stone walls, the smell of the garden, the low sound of wind through the ridge pines. Ray's truck appeared at the end of the road 20 minutes later. He had a bag of quicklime for the garden path and a flask of coffee. He took one look at Agnes's face and asked no questions. They sat on the stone step and drank the coffee while the afternoon light moved across the chapel wall. You all right? He said eventually. I'm all right, Agnes said. By evening, the clearing was quiet again. Ray stayed to help put things away. They sat afterward on the stone step with the last of the coffee, watching the tree line go dark. Any regrets? Ray asked. He had asked that before, early on. He asked it again now, because the answer meant something different at this distance. Agnes thought about it the same way she always did, genuinely, without performing. I regret that I signed those papers without calling a lawyer, she said. That was careless, and I knew better. She paused. I don't regret a single day since. She looked at the chapel wall, warm and pale in the last of the evening light. She had arrived here with nothing and built something that would outlast her. The Connor ledger would stay in this building, in the room where Elias Connor had written it, where Samuel and Miriam and all the others had rested before moving north. The chapel would stand as a documented site, protected, maintained, open to anyone who came to understand what had happened here. Agnes had already arranged for the property to pass to the North Carolina Historical Commission upon her death, with a permanent deed restriction ensuring it remained a historical site in perpetuity. Ray's name was in her will. So was June's. So was Dr. Nance's. Her children were not. That wasn't bitterness. It was precision. The people who had stood beside her when she had nothing were the people she would stand beside now that she had something worth leaving behind. She was 81 years old. She lived in a historical site 9 miles outside Millhaven, North Carolina. She worked 4 mornings a week at a diner on the main road because she liked the work and the company. She tended a garden that was producing more tomatoes than she could eat and had started leaving the surplus on Ray's truck seat without explanation. She woke every morning in a stone building that had sheltered people in the worst hours of their lives and had been waiting for over 150 years for someone to find what was hidden inside it. She had been thrown away at 80 with $47 in a rolling suitcase. She had bought a building everyone called worthless and found inside it something the state of North Carolina had been missing for a century and a half. What her children had called the end of her useful life turned out to be the beginning of the only chapter that would be remembered. Agnes stood, collected the cups, and went inside. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.